shortly.
Order. This is our first session in the Committee's inquiry into the grey zone. We're joined by Elisabeth Braw. Elisabeth, do you want to just introduce yourself and your background?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council at the Scowcroft Centre for Strategy and Security, and I'm also the author of The Defender's Dilemma, Identifying and Deterring Grey Zone Aggression.
It's a great pleasure to have you with us, and thank you for joining us. And you'll have another colleague, Andrew Mumford, who is Professor of War Studies at the School of Politics and International Relations at University of Nottingham. I'm afraid he's been delayed by the trains, but he will be joining us in due course. But Elisabeth, thank you very much for kicking off this session. If I could turn first to John. I think you wanted to start us off, John.
Right, so the opening question, Elisabeth, is how would you define the grey zone?
It is aggression by states or their proxies against other countries or their interests using means below the threshold of armed military aggression.
Only military and physical, or kinetic, or other areas as well?
The moment it involves kinetic violence, and it leaves the grey zone. But the troubling thing is that there are many means you can use below the threshold of armed military violence, and we are seeing it as we speak in the Baltic Sea with our new NATO allies, Sweden and Finland. Sweden in particular, we are seeing the Russian shadow fleet parking itself off the coast of Gotland, loitering there, conducting ship-to-ship transfer of oil, and as a result, Sweden stands to suffer considerable environmental harm if that oil spills, and yet it's not military aggression. The harm that can be caused is obvious in addition to the provocation, but it's not military violence. So that raises the question, as we speak, of what we can do about this kind of aggression.
So where in that spectrum do you place, or do you think it's a separate area? The classic, which we saw in the Cold War, but we're seeing very much now, of agitation, propaganda, undermining social cohesion in societies, and basically undermining the will to take action, or indeed to move people into without disparaging Finland, what it was called in the Cold War, Finlandized state.
We already saw the beginning of grey zone aggression during the Cold War, but what is different now is the availability of means that our adversaries can use against us, simply because the world is extraordinarily interconnected today compared to the Cold War. So adversaries can use not just disinformation and subversion of our civil societies, but subversion of our essentially every part of our societies. They can attack or target our companies, both those operating at home, those operating abroad. As a result of the digitalization of society, they can obviously conduct cyber attacks. They can attack or sabotage sea-based infrastructure, which we had much less of during the Cold War. So the 3.5 decades or so of globalization and the growing together of the world has created enormous opportunities for our adversaries to harm us, and again, there is not very much we can do to prevent that or to punish them unless we decide to similarly operate in the grey zone and use similarly unethical or even illegal means.
Should we though?
This is a defender's dilemma. What do we do if we are faced with all this aggression, both of the illegal kind and purely unethical kind? And I think as liberal democracies we should remain on the high road, but that makes us vulnerable. But if we don't remain steadfast defenders of the rules-based international order and try to set a good example. I think we as the global community face growing anarchy, and we are already seeing it in shipping, for example, which is another area where there is a lot of grey zone aggression. The Red Sea attacks by the Houthis are a perfect example of grey zone aggression. It's carried out by a proxy force, so not an official military force, but yet, of course, it's clear to everybody that it's linked. The aggression is linked to Iran. It targets only Western shipping, and yet we would not be. It would be unwise for the West to say, well, if they target our shipping, we will target theirs. That would lead to anarchy in the maritime domain, and similarly, if we were to respond eye for eye in another domain, it would lead to anarchy there too.
So many of these facets, although with different technology, were very much present there during the Cold War. What lessons are there for us to learn from that, both in terms of mindset and ideology, as well as also a full spectrum approach, which is what particularly the United States and the United Kingdom had during that period?
What can be learned, I think, is that you need to involve all parts of society. And the UK, after the end of World War II and into the 60s, had made incredible efforts to involve citizens in different capacities, so that the state, the government, those working full-time to defend the country would be backed up by ordinary citizens, because the government can't be everywhere all the time. We couldn't afford such an undertaking, and it would also not be an attractive way of life. Then, of course, we had globalization or the liberalization of the 80s, and then globalization, and the idea that you can or should involve citizens, I think, fell by the wayside, simply also because there wasn't really a need for citizens to be involved in keeping the country safe. And I think that is something we can definitely learn. I don't think Brits back in the 1950s and 60s were better than Brits today. It's just that they were invited and encouraged to be part of this undertaking, this collective undertaking of keeping the country safe. Similarly in the US, but less extensive. And it's also an opportunity, I think, for citizens to contribute in a meaningful way to the country. We saw during COVID with the NHS arm. In the moment it was announced, people signed up in such large numbers that in the end the NHS didn't need all these people who wanted to help. So if we look at people's willingness when a crisis strikes, we see that there is a willingness to be part of keeping the country safe. So if we were to set up such structures before a crisis happens, then I think people would contribute, and we would then have this sort of civilian citizen army, resilience corps of people who know what to do. And that is useful not just when a crisis occurs, but as a signaling function, to help our deterrent signaling. It helps us being able to say, to tell the countries and their proxies who may wish us ill that, yes, you can try it, but look, we have at our disposal not just the government, not just the Ministry of Defense, but all these citizens who would know what to do in a crisis. You won't achieve what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Chairman.
Just your comment on the citizens is a reflection back onto the Cold War era. I'm just trying to elucidate what is, and I know Rich is going to come in as well, but elucidate what what's really changed since. And you touched on it, Elisabeth. It's the increase in technology, which means that there are far more capabilities available to non-state and state actors than would have been the case in the Cold War. That globalization has created vulnerabilities, and we are all far more reliant on each other than we were in the past, and that produces cracks that can be exploited. And we've embraced a global view of the world. In the Cold War there were two different camps. There's now a global view of the world. We want people to be acting within that global economy, and that depends on people respecting the international rules-based order. But there are parties that see advantage in trying to disrupt the whole. Am I right in thinking those are some of the areas where we've moved on from the Cold War, it's going to be harder than it was in the era of the Cold War to protect ourselves from these threats because of the nature of how society has changed and how open we now are. Is that a fair?
Yes, it is. And if I can just give you an episode that I think illustrates how society has changed. Helmut Schmidt, who was Chancellor of West Germany in the late 70s and early 80s, he told an interviewer later, after he retired from politics, about a case where the government of Iran wanted to buy a stake in Mercedes, and this was in 1977. Helmut Schmidt told the interviewer that he told himself that the Ayatollah is waiting in Paris. It would not be a good idea for the government of Iran to own a significant stake in the crown jewel of German manufacturing. So what did he do? He called up the CEO of Deutsche Bank and said, you have to buy this stake, and you may not make money straight away, you may never make money on it, but you have to do it. It's your patriotic duty. And Deutsche Bank did buy this stake. And I wonder if today, if Rishi Sunak were to call up the CEO of a leading bank and say, you have to do this, or any leading company, you have to do this because it's your patriotic duty, would they do it?
That's a very interesting question. I think we all know the answer. Richard wanted to come in first, and then Kevin.
Elisabeth, just quickly, in your definition of the grey zone, you mentioned the Red Sea and the firing of missiles by the Houthis, and you also mentioned underwater cables. Are you saying that the firing of missiles at, say, American and US ships, flagships, is in the grey zone, as is blowing up underwater cables, as is alleged to have happened in the Mediterranean, as you know? We think the Russians did that. Are you saying that's all grey zone? Because your definition originally was everything other than sort of bombs, bullets and explosions.
Yes, so regarding the Houthis, it is in the grey zone because they are not an official military, which is of course why it's attractive for hostile states to work with proxies, because if a proxy attacks, we as the West, or indeed any other country...
So that's grey zone, is it?
Yes, if it's done by a proxy, yes.
Okay, and blowing up underwater cables, is that not an act of war?
Well, it depends who does it, and that's why... so the moment we establish that, if we were to establish that it was a Russian military unit that blew up Nord Stream in the Baltic Sea in September 2022, then Sweden and Denmark would have to respond in a military fashion. But if we don't know who did it, or if it was a non-military unit, then it's much less obvious how we can respond. And I think it's interesting that both the Swedish and the Danish investigations have concluded, and they haven't said who the likely perpetrator is. And I think we may never know.
Just finally, so if the Houthis sank a British destroyer, that's grey zone, is it?
If they sank a British destroyer, I think they wouldn't be able to sink a British destroyer, but...
it's not beyond the realms of possibility.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, is that grey zone or is that an act of war?
Well, it is an act of war, but because they are not an established, a recognized military, then it's essentially an act of terrorism, which you don't have the same rule book for how to respond to. Officially, they are just an outfit, right? They are not the government, and that's what makes it so difficult.
The only reason I'm pushing this is because back in my day when I served during the Cold War, that sort of thing didn't happen, but now they are pushing the grey zone right to the edge.
They are.
Through proxies,
almost
to the point of war.
They are, and so we are not talking in the abstract anymore. I think it's unlikely that they would sink a destroyer, but as you say, it's not within the. It is within the realm of the conceivable, and that would put the UK in a very difficult position. And so this is happening as we speak. These developments are happening as we speak, and yet we don't have a strategy, simply because it's not even clear which part of the government should be responsible for grey zone defence. In that case, it may be the MOD, would clearly be the MOD, but it's not always the MOD. And who should be the coordinating part of the government that looks after grey zone defence and possibly grey zone retaliation?
Thank you.
Van, and then Sarah wants to go in.
Can I just pick up in terms of, Elizabeth, the issue you're making around the citizen? I was in Tallinn a few weeks ago, and there, for example, they've got a clear total defence which involves not only training citizens in fighting, but also in terms of medical support, cyber, the entire range of spectrum in terms of seen similar things in Sweden and Finland, and that's because I think you're up against the borders there with Russia. And I hear what you say about the Cold War, but do you think it'd be harder in this country to actually get citizens' mindset now to think in terms like that? Because clearly a lot of people think that really it's quite far away from the UK. In Estonia, it's quite clear the lessons from Ukraine have shown that what they're not going to do is allow territory to be taken. So therefore, there's clearly a psychological thing there. And can I ask you another thing in terms of proxies and where the responsibility lies and where they merge responsibilities? Because there is evidence, for example, the Iranians using organised crime groups in Europe for assassinations and other issues. Now that's a law enforcement issue, but it's also an extension of the Iranians' proxy war against dissidents. For example, there was an individual killed in Belgium, not by Iranians, I understand, but by connections with organised crime groups. How do you coordinate that? Where does that fall? In a military sense, central government, or a law enforcement sense?
That is exactly the challenge, and the challenge of grey zone aggression is that it can happen anywhere, anytime, using any means below that threshold of our military violence, and they will keep trying different ways. And if something doesn't work, no harm done, because there's no price to be paid. And the very fact that they can use any means anywhere then makes it very difficult for the targeted country to know how to respond. I think in the military domain, you can have a good idea of what's coming. You can see what they are planning. You have intelligence. You have surveillance. But within the grey zone, it's just whatever somebody thinks up, and it's very hard to predict. And as a result, it's very hard to know which part of the government should respond and when in fact it only becomes clear what needs to be responded to after it has happened. It is a massive dilemma, and if I can just say something also about citizen involvement, the fact that our society here in the UK can be struck, even though it's, as you say, not geographically close to Russia, I think is a reason for people to get involved and to be invited to be part of the protection of the country. And I remember a couple of years ago, O2, I'm an O2 customer. O2 went down for a day, and every O2 customer was outraged because they had to spend a day without being able to use their mobile phones. And considering that these are the sort of disruptions that our adversaries can cause using the grey zone, then I think it suggests that people would have an interest in being part of minimizing that disruption. Whereas if you think about territorial aggression, well, it doesn't really apply that much to the UK. But disruptions to our daily life in our very convenient society, where we rely so much on various digital and modern means, I think that the thought of such disruption should motivate people to want to be part of efforts to minimize that disruption.
Thank you. The risk is that those kind of actions undermine our confidence in our own society, rather than necessarily blaming other actors who may be provoking it.
Yes, and if I can, Chair, if I can just add a point there, I wonder if it might be not be a good idea for the government to be more transparent in communicating the threats that the UK intelligence are seeing. Until now, the UK government has been very discreet in and not really told the public about any of the threats we're facing unless it's very serious. But that suggests, I think, to the public that all is well and you don't need to worry. So I wonder if it might not be a good idea to be more transparent about the threats that the UK faces and the damage they could cause. And I think that would cause many citizens to wake up to the idea that things have changed and we don't live in the times that we had 10 or 15 years ago.
We're going to Sarah first, then come back to Cavan to pick up our train. But before doing so, if I can just welcome Professor Andrew Mumford, who has braved the trains. It is now with us. You magically appeared in the midst of the last question.
Yes, sorry.
So we're giving you a moment to catch your breath and get into it. So, but either of you, all the questions are to both of you. If there's elements that one of you wants to pick up or leave to the other, that's up to you, unless we may specifically ask for both your views. But Sarah, you wanted to pick up on some of these things.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Elisabeth, I was struck by the time you took to answer Richard's question and the thought process going on there. I was also quite confused reading the brief and reading around this subject about exactly how you define grey zone and state threat, etc. Now, NATO in 2016 declared hybrid action against one or more allies could lead to a decision to invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. So do you think there needs to be a sort of common understanding and language across partners about exactly what we're talking about today? Because how, if you don't quite know what it is and everyone's thinking it's different, how do you then go down the route of deciding whether there's been an Article 5 breach?
We definitely need a definition, and I have to say congratulations to you for catching me out.
I wasn't trying to. I was just curious.
But this is really how grey zone aggression is evolving, that we can have a proxy force that may be in the position of sinking a naval vessel, and we haven't had that in the past. Now the Houthis are clearly so well equipped, and other militias or similar proxy forces may soon be similarly well equipped. So it is a very relevant question. Yes, we need a definition. So there are competing definitions, or I should say different definitions, not competing. But NATO doesn't have one that it uses for as some sort of official definition, and I think that is because grey zone aggression has been considered something that you sort of you can look after when you're finished looking after military defense and watching our adversaries' military aggression. But now grey zone aggression has grown to the point in quantity and variation that we do need a definition. And by the way, not just in NATO territory, but as we're seeing in the Red Sea, in the Strait of Hormuz, and elsewhere. And if we look at, for example, the threats in the grey zone that face our allies beyond the continent of Europe and the Middle East, China's construction of artificial islands, its a threat to use an inspection flotilla to block shipping in the Taiwan Strait, its harassment of civilian vessels in the South China Sea. All of that is happening as we speak and is becoming increasingly disruptive, and yet what is it? We haven't defined it yet, and most importantly, we haven't defined the level above which we consider it unacceptable and will respond.
Thank you.
And I think, if I can just chip in, that's because ambiguity is absolutely at the heart of our idea of hybrid threats. And from, let alone practitioners having problems deciding exactly what constitutes some of these important labels like hybridity, use of force, etc. From an academic perspective, I cannot think of another concept in the study of conflict today that has generated so much existential debate about the very existence of the grey zone or hybrid threats itself. I would suggest a lot of the critics of the concept sort of argue that it's sort of old wine in new bottles, that it's nothing new, that there has always been a hybrid element to conflict since the days of ancient Greece and Rome. I don't dispute that, but I would suggest that it's appropriate to think of hybrid threats or grey zone conflict as a new way of understanding old threats in a new conflict environment. And it's that conflict environment that has evolved so much that I think requires us to start, if not pinning down, because I don't think it's possible to come to a universally accepted definition of hybrid threats in the same way that we can't even do it with terrorism, but we all know what it is when we see it. I think Elisabeth's absolutely right. We absolutely need to be pushing towards a commonality of language, especially across NATO, and that there needs to be more unity of effort in that respect. If the policy responses are going to be coherent enough, we need to be at least all on the same page when it comes to defining those threats.
Thank you.
And do you want to talk into Ukraine?
Can I ask, in terms of the grey zone, what we've learned from recent conflicts, particularly, for example, on Ukraine, your thoughts?
NotPetya was a very good example. So it was a virus that was unleashed by Russia against Ukraine in June 2017. And it was directed against Ukraine and brought down all manner of infrastructure, airports, hospitals, banks, cash machines, and so forth. But because it was a cyber attack, what were the Ukrainians to do? At most, they could have launched a cyber attack of similar power against Russia, but then that contributes to that growing anarchy that we discussed earlier. But what was interesting and I think noteworthy about this attack was that it then traveled on to bring down a string of multinationals, including some FedEx, Mondelez, which makes every snack, every conceivable snack. Anyway, it cost billions of dollars in losses for these companies, and yet it was not. It was very harmful as a result to our countries, to the US, to wherever these companies were based, and of course it was harmful to the Ukrainians. But it was not an act of war. And in fact, as we speak, some of these companies are fighting out the definition of war with their insurers, because their insurers are saying it was an act of war, we are not paying. And these companies are saying, we have insurance, we are expecting you to pay. And so these are very real implications of the existence of this aggression, and yet we don't have a definition for it, and we haven't even learned from the use against Ukraine how we would like to respond to it, and so in terms of what we can learn from what the Ukrainians have done, it is again to involve the public. So the Ukrainians launched the IT army that anybody can join to be part of their cyber effort against Russia. I'm not sure that we can quantify yet how successful this IT army is, but nevertheless, it's an opportunity for people to contribute to the effort. And also, I think, most importantly, what the Ukrainians have done is launch various organizations, not just the government, but ordinary civilians as well have created various organizations in the preparedness and healthcare space, so that the population can respond when there is disruption, when people are hurt, and that I think maximizes the power of the reach of the government. The fact that people are involved and know how to respond.
You said earlier on about calling it out. Do you think what should happen in those situations where you can attribute it, for example, to Russia, it should be called out very, very early in terms of getting the citizens to recognise where it's coming from?
Yeah. Yes, I think one of the differences between the Cold War and today is that our adversaries have lost their sense of shame. So during the Cold War, the Soviets wanted to be seen, and the Soviets and other Warsaw Pact regimes wanted to be seen as respectable, and that's why they signed the Helsinki Accords and so forth, even though they didn't want to. And now they don't mind being seen as rogues, so that we have lost with that the opportunity to call them out, because if we call them out, it doesn't bother them. Similarly, China doesn't mind being called out. The regime is not bothered by being called out. So that is very troubling, and I don't have an answer to it. What we could do when it comes to grey zone is first of all, it's often very difficult to attribute because the perpetrators hide their actions well. But what we could do is accumulate cases, so cases where it's not completely settled beyond all reasonable doubt who the perpetrator was. If we have 10 or 50 or 100 such cases, that we can then combine them and say we have this accumulation of cases where it's very likely that Russia was the perpetrator, Russia or its proxies. So that way we don't have that burden of proof to attribute every single incident.
Just to follow up on that, if I can, to double down on the importance of greater levels of attribution and calling it out. The reason I think that is increasingly important is because it's quite clear that grey zone conflict, hybrid threats, is as much a psychological form of warfare as it is political or military. So we have to start nudging the dial in terms of public perceptions of these threats. You mentioned Ukraine, and of course when we think about hybrid threats in Ukraine, our minds immediately go back to 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. And that was incredibly instructive for framing, I think, Euro-Atlantic perceptions of what this was for two key reasons. Firstly, it demonstrated that hybrid warfare can fundamentally inhibit the decision-making processes of an opponent. Russia's actions in 2014 completely hamstrung the West. We were unable, unwilling to respond effectively. The second lesson I think 2014 taught us in Crimea was that the ability to undermine an opponent through hybrid means was really an attempt to undermine a legitimate use of force in response. And it put the West on the horns of a dilemma. And it didn't fundamentally solve that dilemma of what to do. And I think that's exactly why, fast forward to February 2022, there were still many of us, and I include myself in this, that thought that Russia would not fully embrace the use of conventional land warfare, considering the successes it had had in 2014 of utilising elements of the hybrid playbook. So when we think about Ukraine today, post-February 22, we can see obviously there's a much greater strategic emphasis on conventional warfare. There are still elements of hybrid conflict, as Elisabeth's already outlined too. But if we're going to learn anything from recent conflicts, I think perhaps we need to widen the scope away from Russia. The sources, I think we need to look in terms of the evolution of the threat environment I was talking about briefly earlier. The two things that have changed are the sources and the methods. They are evolving. And to that extent, we really need to keep an eye, particularly on China and Iran, in large part because both China and Iran, unlike Russia, have kept their focus on the ambiguous use of force. They've not necessarily stuck their head above the parapet in the same way that President Putin has from February 2014 onwards.
And look, can I just ask a question in terms of, before we move on to that, in terms of 2014 and Crimea? I mean, what they effectively did very quickly is get the news narrative in the West that Ukraine was always part of Russia. And that was done in terms of, so you had some quite respectable people in this country regurgitating this nonsense. You also had, if you looked at social media feeds, for example, and I was very clever at the time, Russian soldiers playing football with kids, puppies being handled with care, but it was very, very clever, I think, how they did it. How do you actually push back very quickly on that? Because in terms of, for example, the narrative that Crimea was always part of Russia, that dynamic went very quickly, and there's very little pushback from the West very quickly in terms of the news media. It's saying, well, wait a minute, these are the facts. So how do you respond to that? And also the issue that, you've got Russian servicemen and women there in non-visible uniforms, for example, being nice to puppies and playing football with children, so it was a nice friendly invasion as opposed to what happened in 2020. But how do you? That means you've got to push back and be prepared to do very quickly to stop that narrative getting, especially in the internet age where it goes around the world very quickly and it gets embedded. Even some people, can I say, some commentators here who should have known better in terms of reading their history books.
The use of the so-called little green men in Crimea was part and parcel of the strategic masterstroke that the Kremlin devised in order to annex Ukraine. That it was plausibly deniable in a way in which they had got no insignia, no flags on their uniforms as well. There was a level of plausible deniability. Incredulous though it was, the Kremlin could still hide behind it. The most important thing, though, I think, was the way in which they very swiftly went about trying to organise a referenda in Crimea. They essentially used, and I know we're going to come on to discuss this later on, but they essentially used the West's sort of liberal sense of the importance of democracy against itself.
No, but we actually knew the individuals, for example, in Ukraine that actually invented people, local political figures. I mean, Western intelligence had all that. We also had the history of Ukraine. We could actually push back, but there was no pushback very quickly. No. And the individuals in Ukraine who were actually arguing for independence, being part of Russia. I mean, we had all the intelligence individuals. They were invented. They were funded by Russia. Do we need to be very quick in pushing that back to counter what you've just said?
I think it mattered in 2014 more significantly because I think, unlike now, we were seeing a lot more geographically focused hybrid activity in Russia's near abroad, which is exactly why the Baltic states and Finland got very nervous as well, because they also had pockets of Russian-speaking ethnic minority communities close to the border. I think that sort of agitation on the near abroad has moved on since 2014. 2014 was a wake-up call. The West was caught asleep in terms of how to respond effectively to hybrid threats.
Can we actually respond now to those type of things in a coordinated sort of way, not just to one country doing that, but the actual West doing that?
We're learning. There's still a long way to go.
If I can add, it is a challenge because what it would need to involve would be a coordinated action by Western governments and news media, and our governments can't tell news media or news outlets what to do. And this is again one of the vulnerabilities of liberal democracies that we have clearly a division between the government and civil society, whereas authoritarian countries don't, and they can operate in cohesion, whereas we cannot. But I think it would be possible to at least have conversations between our governments and leaders from news outlets to see what can be done to at least limit the spread of disinformation that reaches our citizens.
The thing that amazed me about it is, one, there was no pushback, including just facts about, for example, Ukraine, how it gave up its nuclear weapons, for example, the guarantees that Russia gave the sovereignty of Ukraine, for example. None of that was done. And then you obviously in various outlets have useful idiots that repeat this stuff. But there's no coordinated in this country pushback saying these are the facts, whether from a government point of view or even, I've got to say, in terms of from more inquisitive minds in the media, in terms of saying, well, actually, this is what they're saying here is, and it was quite a clearly demonstrated, like you say, playbook that the Russians had put in place. It had been worked out very carefully in advance. And clearly Western intelligence knew about the individuals that were supposedly, Ukrainian freedom fighters, or want for Crimea to be part of the former Russian Empire, as it is. So people got to move very quickly, haven't they? And I'm not sure. Are you saying that we haven't got that, even now, got that playbook to push back very quickly on these things?
There's been a lot of work done. We are in a much better place now than we were in 2014. I think what was a game changer was the use of defence intelligence in the run-up to the February 2022 invasion. I think that put the UK government on the front foot in terms of trying to control the narrative, in trying to cohere those facts about what we knew, what we did not know, debunking the myths put out by the Kremlin. And I think that, although that was in the context of trying to debunk Russian myths regarding the conventional use of force, I think that sets a really positive and beneficial precedent for the way in which disinformation, as part of a hybrid campaign, can also be pushed back on in a more effective, high-profile way.
Is it a cultural issue in terms of our intelligence services, intelligence world, that we don't put things in the public domain which we should to push back? Like you say, we did, I think, in terms of the invasion of Ukraine. But do you think that reticence to actually put some of that information in the public domain is hampering us rather than helping us?
If it means effectively wresting better control of the strategic communication of what these conflicts are about. Hybrid threats are ubiquitous, but I don't think we've got a decent enough control of the narrative about why they matter to the general public, as Elisabeth was mentioning earlier. And I think, obviously, there will be some pushback against opening up, and I know that the decision to make a lot of the defence intelligence open in the run-up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine was very controversial. We, of course, have to be mindful of the lessons of publicising intelligence, declassifying intelligence very quickly to make political gains. We need to be conscious of the lessons of Iraq here, but we also need to realise that there are actually very large gaps in the way in which we are persuading the British public, the general public in the West, as to the danger of hybrid threats and what we can do about them.
Can I just add one more point?
Please, Elizabeth,
okay.
And then we'll come to Derek.
The UK's response to the Salisbury poisoning was extremely good. So it was a coordinated government action that ended up that made Russia end up looking very silly, and those two intelligence officers were ridiculed around the world. And on top of that, from what we know in the public domain, the UK cut off Russian access to certain financial holdings here in the UK. It was very well executed. It was swift, and I think, at least from what we know in the public domain, it was the UK government just acting at impressive speed and thinking innovatively, and that is a good lesson for future.
We can do it, is what you're saying.
Yes, we can. But I think, interestingly, this in this case, it involved not just the government but the private sector as well. Obviously, the financial sector and various news outlets, and we still don't know exactly how close the collaboration was between the government and the news outlets that then investigated these two intelligence officers. But the result was that the investigations happened very quickly, and we got these revelations about who the intelligence officers were, who the perpetrators were, and in the end, the Russian intelligence apparatus ended up looking very silly.
Eric.
I think, and I want to touch back on something you discussed with John Speller before. The issue around it's more challenging for liberal democracies than China's of this world and Russia, etc., autocratic societies. But is it the case that we're always going to be on the back foot and we're not on the offensive as a democratic, liberal democracies? And going back to the moral question about what are the limits of what we should be doing, given what they do to us. So some of it. Are there any advantages of being a liberal democracy in this field? Are not all cards with the autocratic states? And do we go more on the offensive than we are now? And is that morally okay?
That is an excellent question,
Yeah.
and we are at a disadvantage because we profess to believe in.
Or will we always be at a disadvantage, you think?
Yes, we will, because they can use means that are illegal and unethical, and we would we should not use such means, and that it doesn't behoove a liberal democracy to engage in such activities, which also means that we can't signal, if we're talking about deterrent signaling, we can't signal to our would-be attackers that if you attack, then we will retaliate, simply because they know we won't retaliate, because we won't use those similar illegal or unethical means. So we can't signal if you blow up our energy infrastructure, we will blow up yours, and that is a disadvantage. On the other hand, what we can signal is that we are resilient, and so we can signal that their efforts won't be worth their while, and that is a weaker form of deterrence by denial, suggesting that you don't try it because it's not going to be particularly effective. But we can do that, and that's why I think the public is...
Because I know it's got to be a state decision, not for yours or my individual view, but we bombed German cities during the Second World War, and they bombed our cities. So what's the moral against bombing or destroying a power station, say, in an adversary state, if they do the same to us?
We could, but then that will escalate, and that gives them the opportunity to say, well, we will do even more because you did this to us. And so, yes, we could, and I don't think anybody would begrudge us the opportunity or the necessity to retaliate in kind, but then where does that lead? And also another disadvantage that we have is that we have so many aspects of our societies are connected to the countries that are now trying to harm us. If we were to retaliate by for example, retaliate against a country that had harmed our energy infrastructure, that country, if it were Russia and China, could then harm one of our countries operating there in response. And this is what makes it so different from the Cold War, because essentially our private sector is operating behind the front line and is incredibly exposed, and yet we need them to be reasonably safe where they are, otherwise our economies would be in trouble. I think one of the advantages that we have as liberal democracies is that we are attractive places to live. And our citizens like living here, even though they often complain about it. But if they were to have face the choice of living here or living there, clearly virtually everybody would want to live here. Indeed, citizens of the countries that wish us ill want to live here too. And that is something that we can use to our advantage. And I think we should have used long ago. In other words, signal that we will cancel visas of family members of leading politicians in Russia and China. Then, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we obviously cancelled quite a few visas. But if we had done that earlier, or signalled earlier that if you, Russia, engaged in grey zone aggression against us, we will cancel the visa of one of your citizens, and we will decide who that will be. It can be the son or daughter of one of your top officials, because it's not a human right to get a visa in the UK. It's the gift of within the gift of the UK, so it wouldn't be escalatory either. I think now that ship has sailed with regards to Russia, but with China it would still work, and indeed with other countries that may decide to use grey zone aggression against us.
Hybrid threats pose a massive challenge to liberal democracies, in large part because liberal democracies are forced to try and find an appropriate balance between combating these grey zone threats on the one hand and protecting our own value system on the other. And this is absolutely intrinsic here, because these hostile states in the international system using grey zone threats against us, it's not just about territory, as we saw in Crimea in 2014. It's about norms, it's about destabilising our values, it's about destabilising our institutions, the sanctity of our elections, the sanctity of our rule of law. And this is why the use of hybrid threats in the grey zone really appeals to illiberal states. It appeals to them because, firstly, it allows them to make strengths of weaknesses. Where these states have, for example, poor conventional military capacity or weak economies, they're able to circumvent those restrictions that might place on their conventional use of force, and instead what they're able to do is create surprise out of it, or deniability. So this in part means that what we can think about here is challenges to the West and the UK in the grey zone as being as much about what we stand for and what we do as it is about the sanctity of our alliance or the territory of our allies in the international system too. So what this therefore does, I spoke earlier about the horns of a dilemma. This is where it really does not pay to be a liberal democracy, because this is the exact reason that states like Russia, China, Iran use hybrid threats in the grey zone against us, is because what it does is it fundamentally puts us on this horns of a dilemma. Overreaction makes us look like the bad guys. It makes us look like we've acted preemptively.
So just to say, sorry to interrupt, but if they destabilised our power station in this country, how would it be overreacting to destabilise a power station in their country? If you could, so I'm talking simplistically here.
Yeah.
You know, it's not. You know, well, why is that? Why would that be an overreaction?
So, a lot of hybrid threats exist under the threshold of legitimate response. Undertaking a cyber attack against a power station is one thing. And let's not kid ourselves, we are trying to destabilise the cyber capabilities of our competitors in the international system already. We are doing it. It's about whether you take Salisbury as an example, tit-for-tat responses can create unnecessary vertical escalation. I think we need to think smarter about the way in which we respond, and I think we really need to strengthen and be more proactive in deterring these threats. And I know we're going to talk about deterrence in greater detail later on, but I think more proactive deterrence, denying our competitors not just the capabilities to undertake hybrid threat and hybrid attacks against us, but also denying them the outcomes that they want from all of this is hugely important. But we've got to be careful, because if we overreact, if they undertake a hybrid attack on a power station, for example, to use your words, and there is this veil of ambiguity around who is responsible, because attribution is not an exact science when it comes to these sorts of things, especially in the cyber realm. We could look like the aggressor if we respond in kind. But the danger on the flip side is that, and I think we perhaps saw this in Crimea, in 2014, is that the lack of a response leaves us open to death by 1,000 cuts. And that's the real dilemma. That this is the reason why these hostile states are deliberately using this form of conflict against us, because it forces us to think twice about how we react, and it's very, very difficult. It's a balancing act that we've not got quite right yet. So that's why it holds a fundamental appeal to illiberal states, using it against liberal states. But the question for us, the question for the UK and its allies in the West, is whether to actively change the status quo on our own terms, change the nature of the debate about deterrence, change the nature of the debate about hybrid threats, get out on the front foot about communicating the threats that these have, or whether we're just sort of willing to find, an analogy that I keep thinking about a lot is at the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Reginald Maudlin, the Home Secretary, famously talked about finding what he called an acceptable level of violence. That the British public would think, okay, they'd open their morning newspaper, no, another bomb attack. How many soldiers dead? How many civilians dead? And he talked, it was quite callous and controversial at the time, talking about finding an acceptable level of violence in Northern Ireland. I think that analogy or that phrase actually is really applicable when we start to think about hybrid threats. What is an acceptable level of hybrid threat for the UK to soak up? How many cyber attacks against our critical national infrastructure are we willing to soak up without singing from the rooftops about it with our defence intelligence? This is the dilemma, the horns of the dilemma that I talked about earlier. And I think we really need to get out onto the front foot on this a bit more, because before we know it, this sort of death by 1,000 cuts might have occurred too late for us to do anything really about it, because we have found that important elements, including public trust in our democracies, in the mainstream media, have been eroded beyond repair because of the constant stream of disinformation or constant attempts to interfere in electoral processes. So what's at stake is the sanctity of those norms and ideals that we find important in the West, that are appealing. And I think we need to be, the Euro-Atlantic community, I think, really needs to more aggressively defend the soft power appeals of liberal democracy.
Thank you. Sarah? Yeah, sorry, Emma, go on.
Thank you. Morning both. Just Professor Mumford, on that point there where you said we need to get out on the front foot, I think just in this session today, I'm struggling what the grey zone actually is. So how would you then get out on the front foot with the general public who aren't, interested like we are on this committee?
Yeah.
I'm just struggling how you would actually practically, what that would look like.
It's true. Grey zone threats are omnipresent, but they're intangible. Trying to deter them is the strategic equivalent of trying to catch fog. However, there are practical examples in the day-to-day existence of all of us, all civilians, that apply. Whether it's the security of our data on NHS databases that could be hacked, whether it's the importance of the security of our electricity substations, or whether it's actually more intrinsic about how our electoral systems are. The threat environment at this stage in the 21st century is changing substantially. And the whole purpose of trying to exploit the weaknesses of liberal democracies is precisely because it's about norms and it's about those values that all of our citizens, I think, are participating in or would hold dear, as Elisabeth was referring to, but also realising that hybrid threats do affect all of us, whether it's the ability to use our mobile phones, the ability to access our bank accounts. All of these could come about as a result of a hybrid attack by a hostile state. And I think trying to change the levels of public debate, public diplomacy, strategic communications is all part and parcel, I think, of increasing public awareness of and approaches to hybrid threats. And the problem is, two of the biggest problems in trying to do that and changing that debate in the public is, firstly, public levels of trust in government. That's key. The second is levels of public media literacy. There was a really important study, I think, that was done by the joint EU-NATO Centre for Countering Hybrid Threats in Helsinki a couple of years ago, which looked at how those two things, public trust in government and levels of media literacy amongst the public, were two of the biggest things that contributed towards levels of resilience, societal resilience, within the Finnish public. And from a UK perspective, what concerns me is, firstly, we're now at a point now where the majority of British citizens do not get their news from mainstream media outlets. They get it from social media. That worries me because of the massive open goal that you have to high levels of disinformation coming through those channels. And secondly, public opinion polls show a decreasing level of public trust in government and our national institutions. That's also a problem.
If I can add to that, it is important to have a designated person in the government. It's helpful to have a designated person in the government who communicates with the public about the threats and essentially it becomes the one-person institution because there is no institution in charge of grey zone defense. And a good example of what can be done is Sweden's new Minister for Civil Defense. It's a new position, and he is the number 2 within the Swedish MOD and in charge of all matters, all non-kinetic matters. And he is extremely good at communicating with the public about, on social media and elsewhere in newspaper interviews and so forth, about various threats. And so they know that if something comes up, he will communicate that to them. And it's extremely effective, and in fact, it's inexpensive too. In fact, it's free because he just communicates whatever comes up, whatever is new, and also the fact that he has this portfolio, I think, is really helpful. You can't. At the moment, I don't think any country has figured out what an agency, government agency or department should look like that would cover all kinds of grey zone aggression. But if you at least have a minister in charge of it, then that's a good start. And in general, straightforward communication with the public can happen without any sort of institutional reforms, as long as there is a credible person in the post. But we have lots of credible people in UK politics, so I'm sure that wouldn't be a problem.
Leave that one there. Could be a whole other debate, Elisabeth.
Talking of which, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's a lot to get through, so we need to try, all of us, to be a bit sharp on our questions. Talking of which, Sarah, please.
Thank you, Chair. Elisabeth, so the UK is the third most targeted country in the world for cyber attacks, and just over 24 hours ago we saw a member of staff here be charged under the Official Secrets Act for spying for China. So, without repeating what's already been said, is the UK prepared?
I don't think the public quite understands the threats that exist, and that the government, the various parts of the government, fight off on a daily basis, whether it be cyber or otherwise. And you could say, well, there's no point frightening the public. It would cause them to panic, and why would they need to know? Well, actually, I think it would be useful to know, because first of all, they would realize what level of effort and expertise already goes into defense against grey zone aggression, and also just how perilous our way of life is, and we want to have this way of life. So if we had that straightforward communication with the public, and I'm not saying that the member of the parliamentary staff who has been charged with spying for China would have acted differently if he had realized just how high the stakes are, but plenty of people would be less careless when it comes to their daily life, and indeed down to the very basic level of what they share on social media, if they knew the cumulative effect that these forms of aggression have against our societies.
You mentioned Salisbury poisoning before, and the UK were quite robust in their response around sanctions and expulsions. That obviously acts as a deterrent. But do you think, which is good, a deterrent and punishment, because that's what happens, and you've mentioned it before, that's what happens if you do this in this country, that's the effects of that. Do you think they're built in resilience, though, to make sure a similar or alternative attack would not happen again? Did we learn from it?
The public was never involved in the Salisbury response, which I guess one could argue, well, why would the public need to be involved? But if you imagine a similar incident that may happen in the future, it may affect more people, and you would need people in the town affected to know how to respond if they see people who are clearly affected by some sort of form of aggression, whether it be poison or otherwise. And I would love to see some kind of organization in the UK that people could join, so that they know what to do in a crisis, whether it be flooding or poisoning or cyber power or internet outage, so that they would be the local first responders, so below the gold, silver, bronze level that we have within our institutions, and and if we had that, those institutions would also know that there are trained people in every part of the country, in every town, every city, who know what to do and who can be called up if some sort of larger response is needed. And if we look at, again, the NHS army, people are willing to get involved in this country. Lots of people volunteer. Why can't they volunteer for something that I think is we all agree is the most important aspect of life in this country, which is keeping the country safe?
Andrew, if we look at disinformation, and particularly the use of AI, and you've mentioned electoral interference a couple of times, do you have any concerns as we head towards a general election?
Not as much as if I was an American citizen, largely because I believe in the sanctity of a pencil and a piece of paper, which is very hard to interfere with, and long may that continue. However, the bigger concern are the levels of disinformation that will do the rounds on social media in the run-up to a general election. And that's where the public messaging, the public diplomacy, the fact-checking of claim and counterclaim is going to be really important. But the bigger question about wider preparation, the weakest link in all of this is cross-government coordination. And that's the key. I don't think government machinery right now is fully equipped to deal with the threats that span both the military and civilian divide and the domestic and overseas boundaries that hybrid threats in the grey zone span. To give you an example, grey zone activity in the cyber domain, for example, falls under the remit of the National Cyber Security Centre and GCHQ, while national crises responses that may be manifested through cyber activity falls to the Home Office. The MOD is responsible for cyber warfighting. An overall strategy for cyber falls elsewhere. The same is true for counter-disinformation. You've got disparate groups inside the FCDO trying to counter disinformation coming from specific countries. You've got the Cabinet Office doing the same. You've got MOD through 77 Brigade trying to do it from a military perspective as well. So there's a real dissipation of responsibility at the moment, and that's the problem, right? Now, I don't have a silver bullet solution. What I would suggest is that seeing and observing this level of cross-government dissipation of responsibilities for various different things, I agree with Elisabeth that we need to see greater levels of coordination, and I think that's probably why the National Security Council is going to have to play a greater role in coordinating UK responses to hybrid threats, because these threats span both geography, so whereas the Foreign Office might traditionally have taken a lead on Russian or Chinese or Iranian activity, it spans both geography and theme, disinformation, cyber. So I think trying to ensure that there are units or agencies across across government that have responsibility for trying to coordinate or cohere greater levels of coordination, that's massively, massively important.
While military is running hot, it's got lots of demands on it, it's spread quite thinly. What role should they play? You've touched on 77 Brigade, Army Special Ops, Space Command, for example. What role should they play? Should they play a greater role? Should they be the risk manager of the last resort? Or are they in the right place doing the right thing at the moment?
It's important to remember that grey zone threats are a whole of society problem. They're not just an MOD or even a government problem. They're a whole of society problem. Now, I was really pleased to read in the integrated review that it said that a cross-government approach to countering state threats is hugely important, and I completely agree with that. Defence has got to be at the forefront of coordinating that effort. But here's the rub. It has to facilitate the coordination of these efforts, but I don't necessarily think that defence or the military itself can take an obvious lead. The reason why I think that is because it's hard to justify a strong defence effort in coordinating non-warlike responses or in non-warlike scenarios. And this comes back to what I was talking to Mr. Twigg about, is this sub-threshold dilemma. The military steps in when things breach a threshold. But now, because so much of the threat is manifest at sub-threshold level, it becomes very difficult to ask the military to do an increasing amount of things at the sub-threshold level. So I think that this is where stronger communication with the public comes in again. It would help contextualise domestic threats within an international threat environment. So defence has got to take a lead in coordinating, but it can't be seen to be leading.
Just to go back to Emma's point, you've got sub-threshold, threshold. Where is the line? No one seems to know where that line is, and I think that's the dilemma. Elisabeth?
There is no line, and we have to tolerate a certain amount of unethical and illegal behaviour. We can't respond to everything, but what we need is a threshold below the traditional military threshold, a threshold below that, above which we communicate that we will retaliate. We have to figure out what the retaliation would be, but above which we won't tolerate that activity. So we can say, I think we just have to accept that a certain amount of cyber aggression is inescapable, a certain amount of maritime violations and harassment and so forth. But what is the level above which it's no longer tolerable from our perspective? And so, and I've thought about this for years. What is the level? Is it when one person loses their lives? Is it above a certain level of a certain amount of money lost? Is it about a certain number of occurrences of a particular form of aggression? But whatever it is, that level needs to be defined. If I can just add one more thing to your point about disinformation. London is extremely vulnerable to disinformation as a financial centre. So if we look at how quickly traders react to bad news or to any sort of news about companies, this is an area that countries wishing us ill can exploit by essentially feeding bad news about particular companies into the public domain, and then traders will respond quickly, and those companies, or indeed the London Stock Exchange or FTSE 100, will plummet. Of course, they will recover quickly when people realise that this was based on false information, but nevertheless, it destabilises the whole financial system or the whole UK PLC, and I think that makes it even more important to have regular conversations between business leaders and senior government officials about threats that they are seeing.
Thank you both.
Richard.
I think you've answered part of this question already, but what does UK defence do well in the grey zone? What should it do more of, start doing, or cease doing? Perhaps you'd like to start, Elisabeth.
What the UK MOD does well is step in when nobody else feels that it's their job to step in. So we have seen it across every kind of contingency, including COVID. And in essence, the UK MOD or the UK Armed Forces are so good at their job that we have come to depend on them for every kind of contingency, right? Even to the point where we expected the army to be transporting oxygen and even to stack supermarket shelves during COVID. And that is, well, credit to the UK Armed Forces for being that good that people expecting to solve every issue, but clearly they are not large enough or numerous enough for that to happen. So what they do well is respond to crises of every kind, including of a non-military kind, flooding and COVID and so forth. But I think that the question for me is, why do they need to do that? Couldn't we free up those resources so that the armed forces could focus on things that only they can do, and others with more rudimentary or other skills could look after those tasks that really the armed forces don't need to look after, and the question is then who should it be? And it could be, for example, a volunteer organization attached to the MOD of the kind that Sweden has with the Home Guard. And that would still give the MOD the opportunity to coordinate and to make sure that it's done properly, but you wouldn't have to have soldiers doing tasks that others could equally do.
Andrew.
Briefly, I think the MOD needs to do three things. I think firstly it needs to build a greater awareness of grey zone threats, especially in regards to the way in which it communicates those to the public. Secondly, I think it needs to develop the UK's capacity to deter them. And I think it's an important moment. I believe I'm right in saying that there's a big package of work going on inside the MOD at the moment looking at UK's deterrence strategy, and I think this is an important moment right now to start factoring in lots of discussions about deterrence of hybrid threats into those plans. And thirdly, I think the MOD needs to enhance the UK's engagement with allies in order to strengthen resilience to hybrid threats. I am, forgive me for my historical analogies, I've already quoted Reggie Maudlin, I'm going to quote Dennis Healey now for purposes of political balance. Dennis Healey, what he called it after himself, the Healey theorem, which I'm sure some of you around this table will be familiar with. And he was talking about deterrence in the Cold War. And he said, it only takes 5% credibility to deter a Russian attack, but it takes 95% credibility to reassure the Europeans. He was talking about whether the Americans would use their nuclear weapons. And I think Dennis Healey had got it spot on at the height of the Cold War, and I think the Healey theorem still applies to a large degree today. The reassurance of our allies in regards to the credibility of our deterrence and our willingness to use proactive deterrent threats against hostile states is hugely important if we are to strengthen our resilience. Sarah mentioned resilience earlier, and I think resilience is the bedrock of every deterrence policy. But too much emphasis on resilience, I think, means that we soak up too much. That if we don't start proactively deterring, that we find our acceptable level of violence getting higher and higher and higher because we decide that we are resilient, we can soak things up, and I think that could be a bit dangerous in terms of providing more of a slippery slope. So those are the three things to answer your question that I think the MOD needs to do in this space.
Andrew, you sort of touched on in part two of my question, is the UK being sufficiently proactive both here and abroad in countering disinformation and hostile actions? I think what you were saying in that answer is that there's a lot more needs doing, is what you were saying, I think, so we're not, is the answer to the question, and we need to do an awful lot more, but I think you're saying the MOD is looking at doing an awful lot more.
It's looking at deterrence in the round. Yeah. And of course, our understanding of deterrence, of course, stems from traditional nuclear state-based threats. I think if we are to deter hybrid threats in the grey zone effectively, the UK needs to move beyond a nuclear-centric interpretation of what deterrence is, what deterrence looks like, because we're not here claiming that Russia is imminently about to use a nuclear weapon against the UK or its allies, but we are here saying that Russia, China, Iran, other hostile states in the international system are finding ways to undermine us in ways that are ambiguous but effective, that tackle our norms and our values. It's not just all about territory. So conceptions of deterrence need to evolve and move on and fully embrace hybrid threats.
And as far as grey zone threats from abroad, I think you both said that much closer coordination with our allies is needed to define what we do in instances, as I said to Elisabeth in that first question I asked you, to decide how you counter grey zone or increasingly aggressive grey zone threats.
And this is where it's really useful to have allies, and this is one of the strengths of being a liberal democracy. We have friends and allies. Our adversaries only have occasional partners. And if we look at, if the UK were to be targeted by a particularly blatant act of grey zone aggression, then it should be possible for the UK's allies to respond on its behalf. For example, by revoking visas, by freezing funds, whatever that country may have at its disposal, it should be able to do in solidarity with the UK, just as the UK would do similarly, support that country or come to its aid if it were targeted in the grey zone. When it comes to your previous question about countering disinformation, it can't just be the MOD, and the questions then who in addition should it be? But then the second part of that is we have across the Western world developed quite an impressive awareness of disinformation since it burst onto the scene around 2014, and so it has taken a similar trajectory to dirty men on the internet. Kids know that they should be aware when they use the internet. But the better we get at defense against a particular form of grey zone aggression, the more attractive it becomes for that country to then switch to a different form of grey zone aggression. So this is again part of the defender's dilemma. The better we get at defense, the more likely they are to move on to a new and more productive form of aggression.
Thank you, Gemma. I'm going to Emma next, then I'll come straight to you, Derek, after Emma.
Thank you, Chair. Just thinking about those points in terms of capacity to deter and countering disinformation, we know from our previous inquiries that the MOD and in fact across government, they're struggling to recruit and retain people who have skills in cyber, artificial intelligence and engineering. So is the answer our reservists? Is it the private sector? What is it? How do we kind of solve that problem, for want of a better word?
Well, I'll give you my idea of what I think should happen, even though it's unlikely. It's to look at Norway's system of military service, and the Norwegians have perfected it since the end of the Cold War, when they turned lemons into lemonade. They had military service for all men. When the Cold War ended, they didn't need as many conscripts anymore, so they reduced the number down to a third, and so it became competitive to be selected for military service. And then in 2016 they decided to include women, so then it was down to around 1/6 of all 18-year-olds being selected for military service. So it became extremely attractive. It's like being admitted to Oxbridge. And I think the UK doesn't need conscription for all men, or let alone all men and women, but it could adopt and adapt this competitive, selective Norwegian model and use it not just for the armed forces, but for different parts of the government that play a role in national security. Then you have that reserve of young and then people of all ages with the skills you need in a crisis, and they would be on your standing reserve and would be available to be called up in case of a crisis.
Now, imagine in the Norwegian model they're paid very well, are they?
Sorry?
I imagine they're paid very well in this Norwegian model.
They get a stipend, but yes, it's definitely not a lucrative thing to do, but it is prestigious, and that's what matters. So you have it on your CV, and it almost doesn't matter what it was you did in as part of your military service. What matters is that you were selected, and And it's actually also the perfect social leveler. If you have the aptitude and talent, you are selected, or you have the chance of being selected. It doesn't matter where you went to school. And I think the UK could do the same across various parts of the government. Obviously the MOD, GCHQ, the NHS, the crucial parts that have some responsibility for national security. And then if young people were selected for that program, they would you would not only have this standing force of people who would be able to be called up in a crisis, but you would also establish that link between national security and the wider population, and you would make it incredibly attractive to be part of that effort.
I think coordination with the private sector is absolutely crucial, particularly parts of UK PLC that deal closely with China. we need to understand that the UK, hybrid threats to the UK are a threat not just to UK national security, they're a threat to the UK's growth strategy. They're a threat to UK prosperity in an economic sense, because cyber attacks cost money, significant amounts of money. And it's not just that, we are seeing as well, it's not just the private sector, the public sector is suffering massively as well. We think that the levels of, for example, intellectual property theft from UK higher education institutions is massive. Universities are losing out as a result of cyber attacks. Ransomware attacks we've seen recently in the university sector. So there's got to be greater liaison with the private sector and elements of the public sector too. Greater levels of reservists would be a fantastic force multiplier. But we've got to realise as well is that the private sector has got capabilities that the UK military does not have, and that working closely with the private sector is now going to be a really important force multiplier in this too. I mean, if you consider the way in which the private sector operates or owns large amounts of the UK's critical national infrastructure, they need to be brought into the conversation. If you think about the way in which individuals, the likes of Elon Musk, now have the capability to fundamentally shape battlefields in regards whether they do or do not give access to satellites, is, I think, a manifestation of how important private sector or private individuals are now to the landscape of hybrid threats. So that's hugely important, and I would say that it's not just the private sector, it's the public sector too, but you can tell it's an election year when there's lots of discussions about conscription going around.
Thank you.
If I can add to that, the UK government deserves credit for its efforts so far to involve the private sector, both through the Civil Reserve Initiative and also the work that is underway and is being tested to create a dialogue, also continuing exchange of information between business leaders and the government.
Yeah, could I just ask, because we've talked a lot about who takes the lead and who has responsibility and making sure that all the parts of government are involved in it. In terms of the critical infrastructure, national infrastructure, what role do you think defence should have in protecting that? I mean, clearly we don't have another defence system, and clearly any attacks from missiles or drones, etc., would be a challenge for us. So in terms of protecting critical infrastructure in this country, what role do you think defence should have, or you'd like to see it have?
Clearly, it should be coordinated by the Ministry of Defence, but again, it could involve citizens, ordinary citizens. So, bearing in mind that the armed forces can't be everywhere all the time, there is a role for citizens, and they know their local area better than anybody else. They can tell if something is out of the ordinary. It's essentially a see it, say it, sort it for national security, translated from terrorism to national security. And but somebody would need to coordinate it. It can't just be a phone number that people can call up. But if that were to be implemented, then people would have a way of playing a role and reporting whatever they saw that looked out of the ordinary. Cyber is obviously a little bit different. You can't just involve citizens in cyber protection, but the physical protection, yes. And there is a good example of that, and that is, if you remember the Whiskey on the Rocks incident in 1981, that Soviet submarine was discovered by two fishermen who were out at 4 a.m. and they thought, as I think all good citizens would, that it didn't look right and that it should be reported. So they called the Navy, and the Navy sailed out. Well, what if they hadn't been there? Or what if they had said, well, you know, it's not my responsibility, it's the government's responsibility. So I think most citizens would do the right thing if they had a way to be, well, if there were an organization or a system for them to operate
almost
within.
A citizens' army, but you're talking about rather than just being vigilant, that's being organised.
Exactly.
Organised to be vigilant rather than just...
Exactly, and also be trained in what to look for. Because I may think that something looks out of the ordinary and it's just it was maintenance happening, something like that. And that, by the way, involves the maritime sector. Our merchant mariners, if they see something that doesn't look right near energy installations or sea-based installations, such a system would allow them to have an easy way to report it. They obviously try to report it as much as they can already, but if it were to be institutionalized, then if we make it as easy as possible, then people will want to participate.
Yeah.
A focus on critical national infrastructure really underlines the emphasis that needs to be placed on cross-government coordination, because of the way in which that brings in health, energy, transport, supply chains. And that's a response, therefore, would put the MOD needing to liaise and coordinate with the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, with the Health Security Agency, with the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. So that's a really good example.
Transport.
Absolutely. And the current war in Ukraine has demonstrated just how and why critical national infrastructure is massively important, given the ways in which the targeting of undersea cables carrying internet communications have been targeted. CNI is now a huge target, and the cyber security of installations. You mentioned power stations earlier is a prime example. The cyber security of our critical national infrastructure is also manifest. So things have helped. The removal of Huawei from the 5G network was a very sensible start, but it's the epitome of the need for greater levels of coordination.
The last theme in our last few minutes, and thank you for your answers so far, is about our allies and friends. Where you have mentioned a few countries, but are there particular, as we look at this and look at our at other benchmarks, who's particularly good at this? Who's particularly good at operating in the grey zone? Where should we look for various examples of best practice that could be applied to the UK? Either of you.
I can start. So one very practical example is what the Czech Ministry of Defense does with its grey zone exercises that the armed forces conduct with the private sector, and they take turns. So it's industry or sector specific, and that's something that they implemented very quickly within months after deciding to do it, and they thought first that maybe companies won't be interested. Well, it turns out the companies were very interested, so they then had to be selective, which shows again how concerned the business community is about grey zone aggression. And by the way, it's also fantastic to be able to demonstrate to our adversaries that if you try to target our companies, they are already prepared, and we are working with them. Then another good example is, of course, the Norwegian model of military service. Then the third area is public education, and there we have different allies who do good things. Singapore, annual Defence Day, where all the citizens are reminded of the threats facing the country and their role in keeping the country safe. Similarly in Sweden, where there is a Total Defence Week, and now there are also total defence exercises resurrected since the end of the Cold War, and involving government agencies across the board, the private sector and civic organizations. An example from Finland is their disinformation curriculum in primary schools, and I think that will become standard across the board. But it does leave the question: what about those of us who are older than 11 years old? How are we going to learn how to identify disinformation? But that may be for another ally to figure out. Those are the examples I think I would highlight. And then maybe one last one is the role of the Home Guard in the Scandinavian countries. We don't have a Home Guard here, so it can't be adopted as is, but it does demonstrate that it is possible to involve ordinary citizens in the Ministry of Defence, not in a full-time kinetic capacity, but in a protective capacity with a specific task of looking after the homeland and being reporting to the Ministry of Defence, but not being part of the professional armed forces structure. Over.
I would advocate the Dutch model. So a couple of years ago, the Dutch Ministry of Defence established its own countering hybrid threats unit that sat within the MOD. And what the Dutch countering hybrid threats unit does inside there is it has, in November 2023, led a cross-government exercise in creating a response framework which brought into the conversation all those different government departments that we think need to be in on this. And what's really interesting about the Dutch example is that they work very closely with non-governmental partners as well. They brought in academics, think tank experts, to really thrash out in detail some of these problems, the problems of the threats, some potential responses. And they created this matrix of response which required input from every government department in the Netherlands. And that tried to sort of play out potential scenarios and sort of game particular responses, cross-governmental responses. And it started a conversation. But what's interesting in conversations I've had with members of this countering hybrid threats unit in the Netherlands is that they were very conscious that defence couldn't be seen to be leading on it. And the phrase that was used to describe the role in which this unit did was the Ministry of Defence offered leadership from behind, which I thought was a really interesting phrase. And when I asked for greater clarification as to what this meant, it was an understanding that, in other words, they had to provide the thought leadership on the problem. They had to share resources that they had with other departments, but they could not be seen to be dominating the coordination of these efforts because that would be off-putting given inevitable cross-governmental silos. I would also say to members, if you haven't done so already, is to read the 2020 Deterrence Playbook, which was published by the joint EU-NATO Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. I think that was a real landmark publication in terms of framing the debate about deterrence. And my final thought to leave you with is that right now the perceived benefit of using hybrid threats massively outweighs the cost of such action. Hybrid threats against the UK and its allies have become habitual. We need to break that cycle. We need to adopt a more proactive level of deterrence against these threats.
But you cited very respectable and efficient Western European democracies. Shouldn't we also be learning from the Russians and the Chinese? Because they are experts at this. And they are still, in spite of the changes, basically Soviet administrations. China still talks about the leading role of the party along with Xi Jinping's role. Mm. And they therefore have an integrated political aspect to all this work, and politics ultimately decides that. And politics finds the weak spots and creates the line and works out how to basically try and deconstruct our societies. And what frustrates me is that we and the Americans did that in the 1950s and 60s. You mentioned Dennis Healy. He was very prominent in the Information Research Department out of the Foreign Office, which was absolutely part of that political warfare. United States employed the previous head of the American Communist Party to fight the battles in the trade unions in Europe. And the military do a terrific job, but they're not, almost by definition, they are not politicians. And the political aspect of this, for the Soviets, politics is at the heart of everything. And if we are going to counter them and play defence, but also to take the battle to them. Do we not have to create a political environment, and also, you know, those who can draw up propaganda in the way in which the political warfare executive had tabloid journalists and so on? Don't we need to be evolving to that rather than doing better what we've been doing up to now?
Fighting fire with fire in such a way would be dangerous.
We did.
We did, and to the detriment of the West, which is why the West, the UK, the US, is hated in some parts of the world because of our association with those actions. I agree with you that we need to learn from Russia and China, but we need to learn from them because we need to get into their mindset. We need to understand what makes them tick, what makes them act in the way they do, what is it that they want to exploit. I think it's one thing to enhance our deterrence, but it's another thing altogether to ape their actions. And I think that trying to significantly enhance our deterrence horizontally, it's not just about the danger of escalating vertically. I don't think we should be necessarily averse to escalating horizontally, embracing unconventional ways in which to undermine hostile states too.
Didn't we do that, for example, in Poland, which helped basically to break up the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Empire? Solidarity as a movement had very considerable support from Western agencies and from Western trade unions and other bodies, in order to obviously capitalise on that deep disaffection in Poland, and that helped to basically bring down the administration in Poland and basically cracked open the Warsaw Pact.
One of the challenges is that, by comparison, our adversaries today are much more close than our adversaries were during the Cold War. So it's so hard to communicate with citizens or to reach citizens in China, whereas and even Russia, whereas during the Cold War we had Radio Free Europe and similar, BBC World Service for that matter, through which people were able to learn about life in the West and decide that it seemed quite attractive. But I agree with your point that there are possibly legal and ethical ways in which we can hit back. For example, one way here in the UK would be to publicise every now and then the holdings of various key officials and their family members here in the UK. That is not classified information, and in fact it's something that anybody can find if they go look for it. And that would embarrass those leaders to be found out having significant attachment through their family or themselves to a country that they are officially trying to harm.
Thank you both very much indeed. It's a good session, covered a lot of ground, and we do appreciate it. So thank you for your time. Order, order.
Proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.